Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar. My name's Kaylei, and I'm here today with my boss, our lab's program director, Jess. And just for some background a little bit, we work in the Center for mHealth and Social Media here at UConn, and Dr. Sherry Pagato is our director. And we just wanted to give a really quick background about our center really quickly. So our mission is to advance the science of digital health by exploring novel applications of digital technologies to health programs, using technology to increase the impact and reach of health interventions, leveraging technology to gain a deeper understanding of health issues, and developing new methodologies with digital health tools to conduct clinical research. So really, in short, our center prides itself on merging digital technology and health together. So luckily in our lab, we've had years of experience of doing online research studies. So we hope that today we can share our experiences to help you transition your research online. All right, so as you already know, we are utilizing YouTube Live to do this webinar. So please feel free to ask questions if you'd like. You can use the chat, as some of you already have, to submit any questions. Or you can also email them to us as well at mhealthcenter@uconn.edu. And I just wanted to give a quick background about Jess and I as well. So I'll start with me. So I have worked with Dr. Pagato for about 2.5 years now. I started off as a research assistant and I have moved my way up now to a research coordinator. And what I mostly do is I deal with participants, from onboarding, intervention, and follow-up. And I help with some IRB stuff as well. And Jess, she has worked with Sherry for close to 20 years now, and she manages our lab. And a little bit about our lab is that we conduct studies, mostly on skin cancer prevention and weight loss while utilizing social media and other kinds of app platforms. And currently, all of our studies are conducted online using social media, and thankfully it was the case before COVID-19 hit. So today we hope that our experience with online research can help you. So a little bit more about today's presentation. So during the registration for this webinar, we asked people, as you know, to submit some questions so that we can make sure that we address all of your concerns. We've incorporated most of them into our presentation, and any others we can definitely bring up at the end. We'll have some time for that. So here are some of the main questions that we saw. So how do you recruit on social media? How do you keep participants motivated, engaged, retained, things like that? How do you maintain privacy for participants and confidentiality while you're using virtual platforms? How do you limit duplicate surveys, or how do you get rid of or try to account for people only trying to get money and not really interested in the research? How do you do informed consent online? How do you train participants remotely on how to use an app? And which platforms are most user-friendly for server data collection? So those are some of the main questions that we saw. So we'll dig into each phase of a project to answer all of this. We'll also talk about some IRB as well and some other considerations. So to get started, Jess will go ahead and start us off.
Okay, great. Thanks, Kaylei. I'm excited to talk about this today. So during COVID, many grants needed to be paused due to the in-person nature of research. And so luckily our lab was already set up to do remote research, so we weren't too thrown off by that. We were already sort of prepared to do that. But we could really understand how a lot of other labs could be thrown off if they're not prepared. And also, like, where would you even start? A lot of people don't even know where to start to turn their projects from in-person to remote. So I wanted to take a look to see what the actual impact was, and it's hard to actually see how many projects were affected by this, how many projects needed to be suspended or delayed. So I took a look at clinicaltrials.gov just to see how many had to select suspended, and that was the instructions that were given to us by clinical trials. If you were affected by COVID and you had to pause, you had to click that you were suspended. So I saw that there were over 300 listed, so I wonder how many of them needed to be paused or delayed as a direct result of the pandemic. And now these investigators are faced with needing to extend their grant dollars into additional years, maybe even needing to get more money to do more work or redo some of the research, and how much money was actually lost because of that. And as a manager, I wonder if anyone thought and planned for that situation ahead of time, which I highly doubt. It was largely unforeseen and unexpected. And so now we're faced with needing to adjust our practices to these changes and to this lifestyle. So we can modify current research to be conducted online, and that would lessen the impact of this problem. And so, also thinking on the positive side, how many grant dollars became available because of this pandemic? Is your team set up to handle COVID research remotely? Um, if so, then it really brings you a good opportunity to bring in additional funds, and it lessens the actual risk or the problem or the impact because it would actually open up more opportunities for you. So today we'll talk more about that opportunity. Are you going to let your project pause or terminate, or are you going to find a way to accomplish your goals? And as long as your project is able to be converted to a remote project, then it would be beneficial for you to make that transition. We'll talk about how your project can be conducted remotely to limit the impact of the current problem. And also, hopefully, you can apply some of these strategies to new research so that this type of situation doesn't have to impact your lab again in the future. And so there are many types of projects that could be affected. And here's just a small list. Any of these grants, as long as they're behavioral type focused, can be transitioned to remote delivery. Of course, we have types of projects that need to be conducted in person still, like anything involving x-rays or blood work, things like that. And that will be difficult to transition. But so these are mainly focused on the behavioral aspect. Um, and so we're going to talk about an intervention type project to sort of take you through the steps. And, just remember it can be applied to any type of research. Other types of research that can be transitioned, any sort of app development, user testing can be conducted, um, going from focus groups or anything in person to be conducted either through a webinar or just a user-friendly app somebody can download. So that can easily be transitioned to remote. And focus groups that were originally done in person can be changed to be conducted online or like through webinars or over the phone. Any sort of conferences can be conducted remotely, and any program grants and interventions as well. So let's talk just a little bit more about how to do this. We published some papers about this topic. So if you'd like to read those, I have them posted here. Um, and so the first thing you want to do is really think about some important decisions. So the first thing being your goal. When we transitioned online, our goal was to take weight loss interventions and make them be delivered in an online format. So a lot of this will be directed towards weight loss, but you can sort of apply it to most topics. Our whole idea was to reduce the burden of lifestyle interventions, and the burden being from intervention delivery as well as participant burden. We wanted to reduce in-person visits, but also um, maintain the level of social support, as well as even increasing it if possible. We wanted to make this type of program acceptable to like a wider range of people. While we realize that going remote actually limits certain populations without internet access, it still broadens our reach to areas that might not have access to that kind of program due to their location. Um, so first thing you want to identify is what is your ultimate goal? If this is a step that you see using from now on, think about your future and how this goal can be transitioned to all of your projects. However, if you just need to get one project up and running remotely so that you can wrap it up, you might want to put a different level of effort into it. So the next thing you want to do is define the parameters of your intervention. What's the modality? Is it just a social media feed, or will it be an adjunct to a phone call or text messaging? Will the content be distributed daily or weekly? and how many times a day, who will post the content, who's going to be your moderator. So you want to sort of identify all of these little details. Your next decision is to figure out which platform you want to use to get your content to your participants. There are pros and cons to each platform, so make sure you research each one, and we'll talk about some of them later. In our work, we started using Twitter, and it's a user-friendly platform. We're able to create a private feed for only our participants, so we decided to use Twitter. We've also used Facebook. So once you've figured out which platform you want to use, you want to modify your intervention content to that platform. And so you would take each intervention module and actually create posts for each module, or multiple posts for each module. Find some great high quality images and to pair with them. And then you want to think about how you can keep your participants engaged, because you absolutely need an engagement plan. Just plain information dissemination will bring you crickets. So you really have to make it structured and interesting. Um, in some of ours, we incorporated posts about goals and then asked people to tell us how they achieved them. So that gets people talking a bit. We also post polls and question and answer discussions, challenges, contests. Ask people to share pictures or GIFs. People love posting pictures of their pets, just trying to find unique ways of keeping people engaged. So once you create your content, you're going to want to ask yourself, are you going to pilot that content? You want to make sure that it's being received and interpreted by your population in the way that you want. We had actually multiple iterations to make sure it was how we wanted it. We tested it 3 times with 10 to 12 participants each time, just slightly changing the protocol just to see which way would work best. If you don't have that level of testing, at the very least, just show some posts to people to get some feedback. We always test our content. In projects where we did not test it, we actually found ourselves revamping the content as time went on, which ended up being costly and time consuming. So these are just some of the initial things you want to think about. If you want to dig more into these decision points, check out the second paper I have listed here. I think it would be pretty helpful. The next thing you want to think about is how this will all work out logistically. So digging a little bit deeper into an intervention, when we moved from in-person to online, we had to think about how we deliver our intervention. How would we get our participants weights, and how would we record attendance? So we had to think about things like that. How do we do all of this online now? So now that we are online, we had to make those decisions. So now we decided to automate our content so that we post regularly twice a day, and we use Fitbit scales to collect weight. So that allows a standard measure of weight that's not self-reported. So that was really great to find that feature. We decided to take a look at attendance by defining it according to how much people engaged with the social media feed. So instead of saying yes, check mark if they attended a visit, now we're looking to see what they're actually doing. Are they liking posts? Are they posting themselves? Are they talking to other people? And another thing in weight loss research is the process of calorie tracking. We were able to move that from handwriting to tracking on MyFitnessPal. And when you use MyFitnessPal or other types of calorie tracking apps, you can still share it with your coach or your interventionist. So that's a great feature. They can still provide coach feedback. So another thing I wanted to mention about this is thinking about engagement in a group session, because it's really easy to see when someone's not engaging. So you can just, point to them and call out their name, or have a very directed conversation. So it's a little bit different on social media. So you have to come up with some techniques that will help get through that. Like you can DM them or tag them or call them if they're not engaging. So when you're making these changes to your intervention, one thing you might want to do is see what's out there already for whatever condition it is that you're studying. So this is very directed towards weight loss, but I know all of you out there have different types of conditions that you're studying. So make sure to see what's already out there in the literature. Look to see if there are already ways that technology is being used in delivery, what's already been done. So there are so many technology methods like webinars, text messages, phone calls, mobile apps. So see what's already been done so you don't have to start fresh. There might already be something out there. However, if there is not something out there, maybe it would be good for you to get started and take that project on as your own and get that message out there and publish something about that. So now let's talk a little bit about recruitment and follow-ups and other documentation. Go ahead, Kaylei.
Awesome. Thank you, Jess. Alrighty, so now we're going to talk about the screening process. So this process typically starts with recruitment, and then after recruitment, you would have a consent phase, a screening phase, / orientation phase, an eligibility assessment, and then you go ahead and do some study measures. So how do we transition to each of these to occur online? So let's go ahead and start with the first thing, which is recruitment. So I wanted to show you what the online recruitment process would look like. So the very first step would be is that a potential participant will see your recruitment ad online. So what's going to happen is you'll post online and they'll see that. So if they're interested, what's going to happen is they'll click the link in the ad to bring them to an initial eligibility screener. And basically, this is an online survey that includes consent and eligibility questions. And other options could be to direct them to an email or phone number or something like that. But this method is definitely the most streamlined. You'll definitely end up losing participants if you add these extra steps for them to call or email. So from there, once the participant clicks on the link, the first thing they will see is the screening consent form, or excuse me, they'll see the consent form. And from there, they'll read through the consent form and then they would indicate if they want to participate or not. You would get a signed consent waiver from your IRB to do this type of consenting, and we'll definitely talk about consenting a little bit more in the webinar. So once you do that, they'll read through the thing, like I said earlier, and then they'll select yes or no. If they select that they do not wish to participate, then the survey will just end from there. And if they select yes, that is what counts as them consenting. And then they're brought to the screening questions on the next page. Then the screening survey will contain eligibility questions for your study, and then also an email address field so you can get in contact with them. Plus, I do recommend a question or two to weed out any kind of fraudulent participants, which I'll talk about later. Study staff will review the responses of each of the surveys that you get that come in, and then you would want to email them whether they are eligible or not eligible. And then one little tip I have before I move on is that we suggest not providing any compensation for completing this initial survey, since you can get a lot of like duplicates, a lot of people doing many surveys, or maybe fraudulent responses. So you want to include the screening compensation at the end of the screening phase instead of just after the survey, so that you have that chance to weed through all those responses. All right, so now that we have an idea of sort of how the process will work, let's go ahead and develop a recruitment plan. So when you recruit online, there are a lot of moving parts. There's just so many opportunities to do online recruitment. So the first thing you're really going to sit down and figure out is which strategies are you going to use for recruiting online. Like I said, there's so many. So you could have, social media. You can do paid advertisements on different websites and like also do social media platforms. You could do podcast appearances, you could pay influencers, you could do radio advertisements, you could recruit Qualtrics or do something on ResearchMap. So I could just go on and on. So there's just so many different options. So what you have to figure out is what options are best for your population. And social media is one avenue we highly recommend because most people at all ages are using it and it's very popular. So this brings me to the next part of the recruitment plan. Since there are just so many different social media platforms to choose from, you want to figure out which specific platforms on social media you're going to want to use for your study. So it's really important to take some time to do some research and kind of figure out which platforms is best for your population. And there's definitely research out there. Pew's Research Center's website is a great resource because you can find out, if you wanted to target your study by age, maybe interest or gender, ethnicity, something like that, you can research that and find out the best platform that way, and then you can use it to your benefit. So then from there, once you kind of figure out the details of what methods you're going to use, what platforms you're going to use on social media, you're going to want to go one step further and you're going to want to lay out how exactly you're going to use each platform. So, for example, just say you're using Facebook. How exactly can you recruit on Facebook? So the first option is that you could use paid advertisements. Then there's the option of getting into private and open public Facebook groups and then posting your recruitment message in those. You could have your followers share your recruitment message from your Facebook page. So there's just all these different options on just one platform. So this is just the type of thinking you're going to have to apply to each platform that you choose to use. And then from here, the next thing you're going to want to think about is how much time and effort can you and your staff put towards recruitment? So if it's a lot, then you know that you can take on a plan that's definitely heavy on staff time and, really using them for recruitment. And if you don't have a lot of time or resources, you can look into the methods that don't require as much staff effort, such as using like a company like Qualtrics, who will do most of the work for you. There's no really right or wrong way to recruit online. You just have to figure out what best works for you, your study, your timeline, and things like that. And then finally, you need to consider your budget. So if you choose to do online advertisement, what you should do is really break down how much money you want to spend sort of overall in the study, and then also buy online platform to outline where you're spending your money. And it's important to note that even though whether your budget is big or small, online recruitment can really be effective no matter what. And then just really quickly, if you want to hear more about developing a recruitment plan, you can check out a previous webinar I did for the center back in February of this year. It's definitely it targets social media recruitment. So you can find the link on our website under events at mhealth.nship.edu, or I will go ahead and post the link right now in the chat. Okay, so let's go ahead and move on to create images. So when you have a recruitment plan in place, the next step is thinking about your recruitment message. So obviously that's the first thing that participants are going to see. So one thing that I highly recommend to do is create visuals for your online recruitment. So in any online method that will allow you to add a picture or a flyer or some type of visual or graphic, I definitely would take the time to do it. The visual is really what's going to grab people's attention and attract them to learn more about the study. So as you can see here, we have two examples of what types of images we would normally use. Just some common themes that you'll see in our images, that they're bright. There's some fun graphic elements to them. The text is straight to the point. The font's easy to read, things like that. And, there's so many different websites out there that you can use to create these visuals. Our personal favorites are canva.com or pablo.com, and they're both free to use, but they also do have premium subscriptions you can sign up for, which are also you would have to pay a fee for if you wanted to upgrade that. And then also, when you use visuals with minimal information, you want to include a recruitment message with it. You want to make sure that you include all the important information, but at the same time, it still needs to be concise. So I would just say, as a basic format for a recruitment message, is you're going to have like one point, maybe a quick sentence or a question to grab people's attention. Then you're going to want to have a sentence or two, not too long, to talk about the basic study information. And then you're also going to have a link to that screening survey and the consent. So if the message is too long, nobody's going to want to take the time to read it. But also if the message is too short, it could come across as spamlet. So there really is a balance. And what we like to do in our lab is we like to have someone draft the first round of all the messages, and then we send it around and get feedback from others. So that way we can help perfect it. Okay, so let's talk about staying organized. So staying organized is really a key component no matter what study you're doing or what you're doing, whether it's online or in person, but it's especially important when you're doing online because there's just so many moving pieces. So the first thing you're going to want to do is keep track of where you're posting online and how each platform is being used. You're also going to want to keep track of your budget. You're going to want to make sure that you're not going over your limits for any of the advertisements you're doing. Some of the platforms will ask for a daily budget rather than a total budget. So you need to make sure that you're only spending what you can afford. So I would make sure that you're checking your advertisements at least 2 times a week, if not more, just to make sure that you're on track. And then finally, you want to keep track of who's doing what and who's in charge of what method. And now that a lot of labs are now moving and working from home, all your staff might be all over. So what you want to do is having this will keep way to have staff and students be accountable, as well as this helps to ensure that everything's getting done when it's supposed to and you're keeping on track with your timeline. And what we do in our lab is we have a shared Google sheet that we all use to keep track of which place we were posting in and when we did that post, and shared our recruitment message. And it's really so helpful so that we can see where our efforts being spent and how often as well. And it helps us to adjust anything accordingly. Additionally to this, we also have regular meetings, whether it's weekly or bi-weekly, depending on how hard we're pushing our recruitment, to kind of check in with each other and see how everything's going. And another good thing about staying organized is that it can be important for any future studies that you may do online. You can look back and see what type of recruitment really worked well for you and sort of what didn't work as well. So you can spend more time in the future on successful ventures and kind of just, move on from the stuff that didn't work as well. All right, so now we can move on to talking a little bit more about the online consent process. And I know that we had a few questions about this, so we'll hopefully answer it to the best of our ability. So the process that we follow is twofold. We want to, of course, first fulfill our ethical duty to properly consent our participants, but we also want them to remember the details of the project and what they're committing to. So the key word here is informed. So make this process so that you can properly consent participants, as well as, once again, help them remember the key points of the study and what that entails. So our process, like I said, which we really highly recommend for any online intervention, is as follows. So first, you want to have them read through the consent form before completing the initial eligibility survey. And then after they read through it, they can select yes or no if they would like to participate or not. After they do that, what we would do is anybody that's eligible, we go ahead and email them a copy for their records. And then we set up a time that we can have a quick conversation with them over the phone where we go over the consent form again. And then right before randomization, we'll also do an orientation online over a webinar that will again outline all the procedures of the study. While we don't really count this as consent, we just do it again so that they can really remember the details of the project and they fully know what they're getting involved in. So, you're probably wondering why we do all of this. Well, we did notice that a funny thing happens that if you don't repeat the information enough and in different ways, the participants will only remember some of the details, and communication can be misconstrued and some information can be confusing to them. So we really found repetition is to be key so that they fully know what they're getting involved in. So here you have on the slide just an example of what the beginning of our consent form would look like. So once again, before they answer any of those eligibility questions, they have to review the entire form and then provide consent. And it reads just like any other consent form. All we do is just format it for online, and then the two options you see on the right is where participants either select yes or no, which is what counts for them consenting. All right, so we have now covered recruitment, consenting, and the initial screening. So let's go ahead and talk more about telephone screenings and study orientation as well. So a lot of investigators want to skip this step, so that they can make their procedures entirely online and streamlined, but there are several reasons why you don't want to skip this step. So the first reason is that it adds an extra step to screen out those fraudulent research participants, which I was mentioning earlier. So when you're recruiting online, unfortunately, it's a lot easier for fraudulent participants to partake in your research. And these are people that are typically trying to take advantage of the perks of a research study, like maybe compensation or other materials that they would get for free without actually having any interest in taking part in the research. So when you add the additional step of getting them on the phone, it requires more effort on the fraudulent participants, and they typically just won't follow through. And then another benefit of a telephone call is that you can get clarification from participants, and then also they can get clarifications from you about the study. So getting them on the phone allows you to get more details so that you can determine their eligibility. It also allows participants to ask any questions they might not have been able to as they were going through that initial survey. And then finally, once again, kind of hammering home this point, is getting them on the call is another way to consent them. And this is just an added measure so that we can make sure the participants are making an informed decision. And though they've read it before the screening survey, there's really no guarantee that the participant took the time to read it all. But over the phone, you can read everything out to them so they can hear it and then once again figure out if it's a good fit for them. So the telephone screening phase, this happens after a participant completes the initial screening survey and is eligible, but before any baseline measures are completed, so sort of in between. This gives the participant a chance to talk to a real human to really show that the study is legit and also gives the study a more personalized touch. So it's really important for participants to talk to real humans throughout the process. Although it's online, that's really great. But and it's really important for them to hear real humans to kind of have that touch. So the first step in the telephone screening process is to email the consent form and ask them for their phone number and availability so that you can have a phone conversation with them. And then just to be mindful, not to bother them too much, what we like to do is we email them a total of 3 times, spanned out every 2 days or so. And if there's no response to any of those 3 contacts, then we just kind of stop contacting them and let them be. So say you email them and you get them on a call or schedule a call. You'll get on the call with them, and what's going to happen is you'll review the study and more details, go over the consent form again, verbally ask them for their consent, and ask any questions that you need to do in order to clarify their eligibility from their survey. And you also want to make sure to allow some time for the participant to ask any questions that they may have as well. And then from this point, you would go ahead and make a final eligibility determination to see if they're good to go or if they don't meet the requirements of your study. Maybe you kind of had a feeling and they seem fraudulent or their clarifications make them ineligible, then you go ahead and let them know and end the call. If they are still eligible at this point, you just go ahead and let them know, go over all the next steps and what to expect in the rest of the onboarding process, and then go ahead and email them their baseline measures from there. All right, so let's talk a little bit about orientation. So for any intervention study, you'll want to be sure to incorporate an orientation into the screening process. And what we do is we incorporate this right before randomization, and they can be conducted easily over webinar, using PowerPoint slides. They don't need to be in video or anything like that. During the orientation, you'll have an opportunity to talk a little bit more about the research you're doing, why this research is important and what the ultimate goals of this research is. You're going to want to educate them on, what exactly you're doing in the study and how it's different than like a community type project that's open to the public because, you're collecting data. You also want to inform them how important the data is and that without the data, there really would be no project. You really want to hammer that home. And they also should know that if they miss like a follow-up point, it hurts the data, therefore it hurts the study. Another important point that you want to talk about in the orientation is that they should know that if you randomize them into the study, then you expect them to complete the follow-up because they would have taken a randomization spot of another participant who could have possibly benefited from the project. From there, we like to go through possible barriers to participation to get them thinking critically about if they really want to do the project and if they're willing to commit to the intervention and completing all the follow-ups. So what we normally do is we ask about, 3 or 4 questions or so regarding possible concerns they may have, and then they'll respond in a chat so they can take an active role in that conversation. We also use this kind of orientation to train participants on any apps or any programs that they might use during the study. And you could also do it individually through phone call as well. But a webinar lets you share your screen and show slides, so there's that visual aspect that a phone call may not provide. So this kind of webinar usually takes about an hour or so and definitely contains a lot of information. It's much more detailed than your phone conversation with them during the telephone screening phase. So you want to keep it separate from the consent process to avoid that information overload. And also, like we said before, repetition of information is always good to ensure that they absorb as much information as possible. And also, clarifies any confusion. And what's so great about this type of orientation is also how it helps retention. So in one of our studies, we started getting poor retention, and then what we ended up doing is incorporating these orientations. So just looking at the graph on our slide, can you guess which wave started using them? So I think it's kind of, obvious. So go ahead and look at how our rates jumped from wave 2 to wave 3. So, it was really incredible. There's such a very visual difference. So since then, we've really always incorporated this step. And also, do you have a focus group in your study? If you do, or you're doing a focus group type study, using a webinar is also a really great idea to conduct those as well. Most webinar apps or, applications and websites have recording features. Once again, if you don't have webinar access, you can also do it over the phone using a conference line. Alrighty, let's move on to retention. So regarding retention, you really want to have a specific protocol worked out for how you're going to keep participants engaged. Retention does not start at just the follow-up phase. You're going to really want to start at the beginning, so you have to work up to it. And like we said, we start retention at the orientation. And then the intervention phase should also have a retention plan in place. And what we like to do is kind of reach out to the participants who have kind of gone dark, they're not engaging or anything like that. So you want to have a multifaceted approach and have different ways to get them back engaged or getting in contact with them, because one-way contact usually is easy for them to ignore. So what we like to do, is since we do mostly Facebook studies or Twitter studies, we'll first tag them in a post that we have. And, if we don't hear back from them, then we'll private message them on whatever platform we're using. Maybe that doesn't work. We'll go ahead and move forward to email, see if that works. And if not, we'll go ahead and call them. So that's just sort of how we approach working out retention and also keeping the participants engaged. Another thing that's really important is that you want to make sure you have basic communication skills in place. They're really going to want to be heard and know that they can come to you with any issues. So you want to make sure that you provide that kind of environment for them. And then another thing to do is offer individual contacts. So maybe they don't want to say something in front of the whole group. So maybe you offer contact with just the counselor or just the coach, or maybe somebody from the staff, just someone that they feel comfortable with. Another thing you want to do for retention is that you want to allow flexibility. Say they're going on vacation or something. You can let them know that it's okay, that they don't have to feel that they need to keep up with the intervention so strictly on a week when they're somewhere that they don't have regular internet access or something. And then they can come back to it when they're back from vacation, and we make sure that they get caught up. Maybe if they're having a Wi-Fi issue or you have somebody that has connectivity issues, you can offer to get them caught up over the phone or something like that. And then another thing that's really important is making sure your content on your intervention is relatable and interesting. If that's just sort of just like one long article or something like that, it's not something that will get them having a conversation and they'll kind of just scroll right past it. And then another big piece to it is engagement. So you really want to make sure that participants are engaging on a regular basis from beginning to end. So to do this, you really want to create a welcoming environment so participants feel that they can open up and they can share. You want to have that community feeling, and then they can feel like they have some kind of connection with participants. So as much as you can encourage that, the better. In a recent project at the end of the intervention, what we did is we asked participants what they thought would make make other participants engage more. And about 20% of them indicated that they wanted more out of other people rather than the counselor. They wanted more sharing and more support from each other, more of a sense of welcoming, community feel, just kind of more an overall connection. And then another 20% wanted more, contest type posts. They wanted more polls, question and answers, things like that. So the more that you can do these kinds of stuff to encourage engagement, the more receptive your participants will be and the likely they'll stick around longer. All right, so I am going to go ahead and hand it off to Jess to talk about the IRB.
All right, thanks, Kaylei. So yeah, talking a little bit more about the IRB, we did get a lot of IRB related questions, so I'd like to go over some modifications to keep in mind. The IRB is always slightly different from institution to institution, so be careful for that. And make sure to follow the specific instructions from your own location. So we did already talk about consent forms, and I did want to just clarify one point where we did have a question come in with how long a consent form should be, and if it's taking away from people wanting to participate if it's too wordy or technical. And so when you're using an online consent, make sure it's an abbreviated version, which is usually available from your IRB, a template. They usually have a shortened version, which is called an informational form, or a standard long consent form. So make sure you're using the shorter one, keep it as short as possible, and get rid of the technical terms. They will not know what you're talking about, and that will definitely turn people away. So, just make sure it's at the appropriate reading level. So some things when you're modifying your project to an online format, here are some of the sections that you'll want to include in your IRB protocol, will include for edits. When you talk about, or when talking about the study population, make sure to state that people are now going to be recruited online. So they could be coming from anywhere, the US, the world, whatever, rather than just a local sample. So they'll want to know that. And also, when you recruit online, it will drive up your recruitment numbers since people will be clicking on the survey link and likely closing out before they complete the survey. They are still considered consented. So that's going to count towards your enrollment numbers. So you'll want to bump those up. And you'll have to change your recruitment section as well. The IRB will want to know where you're planning on posting, how you're going to be posting on these platforms. Are you going to post from your personal account, from your study account? Are you going to ask other people to share your posts? There are a lot of different ways that you can do that. So they want to know how you're going to do it. And what is your strategy? And why did you pick these locations? For example, our IRB, we described that we're recruiting on Reddit because almost 3/4 of their users are male. So we used that to justify recruiting through Reddit to bolster our male sample. They'll want to know about the procedures of your online process. So describe what participation looks like for participants from the very beginning of the study, starting with that recruitment message when they click on it, all the way to the end. What materials are you going to need for the process? Any new materials, submit them. And so also talking about measures, how are your measures going to change? Like we were talking about earlier about our weight data being collected through Fitbit now rather than an in-person weight. So take a look at the measures on your study to see what needs to be changed to an online format. You'll want to edit the potential harms and risk section. Make sure you edit those changes. They're different when you're dealing with an online project. You're faced with things like breach of confidential information due to hacking. I think MyFitnessPal had a big issue last year, and Twitter did as well. So, make sure you have a way for handling that. Know your terms of use for the platforms you're going to use and tell the IRB what they are. How are you going to ensure participant safety online? Will people be able to share posts that happen in the group to people outside of the group? Those are things you'll want to consider and cover in your privacy section. Also, you talk about how you're going to manage participant data online. Where is the data going to be stored? How are you going to get it? Are you using an app, and are you collecting data from the app? How are you getting it, and how is it being protected? You also may have to edit how participants are getting their compensation. If it was through, handing them a gift card, you can now do that through email. So you'll want to change that as well. And in the consent section, you can indicate that you're seeking a waiver of signed consent. Not consent altogether, but just so that you don't need a physical signature from participants. And just some other documents that you want to update include any of your standard operating procedures that you use for running your lab, the consent form we talked about already, the scripts that you use in talking about the study and emailing people maybe for reminders for certain things, add any scripts, any emails, word for word. Um, so also your data collection procedures are going to change. We talked about that a little bit on the previous slide, so make sure to update that. And your storage of data will certainly be different. So make sure to update those sections and provide any new surveys. Make sure you keep a copy of all edited versions of these documents. Usually the IRB wants to see where the edits are, and you'll want a final version, but it also helps give you, um, you know, a reference for where the changes were made and what changes you had to do. So keep those for your records. So talking a little bit more about privacy and confidentiality, it can become complicated when you're doing online research, but it doesn't always have to be complicated. Just to minimize any privacy and confidentiality concerns, I first recommend using programs or applications or websites that are already approved by your university. For example, UConn has already approved REDCap for us for data collection, or WebEx for conducting webinars. So we make sure to use those, but it may change, from institution to institution. And so the ones that have already been approved by your university are good to use because they've already been vetted, and it saves you a lot of time and effort so that you don't have to try to justify your choice to them because it's already justifiable. Being transparent also helps eliminate any concerns. That's transparent to the IRB as well as participants. Talk about your concerns, list any privacy and confidentiality concerns that you can think of and how you're going to address them. And if you can't find a way to address them, then you might have to pivot some aspects of your study, because obviously unaddressed concerns won't be approved by the IRB, but also if you know of a concern, you're sort of obligated to try to figure that out and make it work just from an ethical standpoint. And also, when you're transparent to the participant, it shows that you really don't have anything to hide and you're trying to protect them. And it allows them to truly decide if they want to be in the study or not. We have a lot of people not wanting to participate in our research just because it's online. So definitely let them know as much as possible. So most importantly, make sure you have a concrete plan in place for how you're dealing with participant data at every single phase of the study. Lay out those details. Who is talking to participants? What type of interactions are they going to have? Phone calls, emails, webinars. How often is it going to happen? And what would be discussed during each of these times? Do participants interact with each other? Who has access to that data? And what will you be doing with that data? So that just helps the IRB and participants because they can see how everything is being protected and how everything is being used. Just a few quick tips that we've learned along the way with the IRB. The first thing you want to make sure is that you include variety in the recruitment wording. If you just submit a whole bunch of different versions, a ton of different images, then you're less likely to have to keep modifying that if you're realizing, oh, this wording doesn't really pull in many people, so then you have to modify it and put in a whole, some new ones, and then you have to wait for it to be approved. That could, cause an issue with your timeline. So if you just put in a whole bunch of things, get them approved right at once, that would be better. And also, one thing to keep in mind is character limits. Like on Twitter, you have 280 characters to use. So if your recruitment message goes beyond that, then you cannot post on Twitter until you get a modification. So so be mindful of where you're posting. And then also just be general, with your posting. So if you're recruiting online, say like, I'm going to be posting on Twitter and Facebook, as well as any other online programs. So by doing that, you're keeping it open by saying online programs or online platforms rather than being very specific. Some IRBs might require every single location to be listed, but some don't. They just want to know that it's going to be online and what the wording is. And as long as that's approved, anywhere you post online is okay. Um, and so that would limit you from having to wait for IRB approval as well, which could take some time. So talking, I know we only have about 9 minutes left, so I can hurry up and wrap up. Talking about data collection for a minute, because this is very important. Any surveys that you originally did on hard copy, paper and pencil, they need to be programmed into an online survey. If you're administering measures that people would normally do in person, I would recommend changing or checking the literature on remote ways to collect the data. For weight, we found that Wi-Fi scales worked well, for other studies. So that's how we decided to use that for ours. So if you're unsure about what to do, check the literature on what's already being done. There are different types of data collection technology that you can use. If you're on a social media platform, you could use a program like Gridix, and that would extract data from Facebook for you. And you definitely want to look at that engagement data if you have that kind of intervention where you're on Facebook and participants are engaging with your feed as well as each other. You want to see how the different types of communication will affect outcomes. And that can help you refine your intervention in the future so that it's structured in a way to elicit meaningful conversation that can help steer participants in the right direction toward their goals. So that it is important to collect that data if you can. So take a look at those online tools and what type of data you want to collect from your online program. And there are other programs and Capture that collects tweets from Twitter, Fitabase to collect Fitbit information. We did have one question about how we deal with connectivity issues when we collect data. And we don't typically have that problem. Sometimes, though, it does take a little while to get a data export, like from Gridix. I never had an issue with REDCap, but Gridix sometimes could take a couple hours. I think we even had an issue for a day or two at one point, but I think that was some kind of bug or something. So make sure you research the program you're going to use. And so I have a Dropbox listed on here just for the sake of communicating with your staffing. There are lots of file sharing programs. Use one that your institution recommends. Each institution has their own. So it's good for collaboration and it helps increase communication back and forth. So to wrap up our talk, we wanted to move on to just some considerations that might not be directly related to your study procedures. And first is your staffing. You may have a lab, a funding for a full-time lab manager, but if not, then make sure you have like a research coordinator or someone who's capable of monitoring your staffing as the project moves to a remote transition. They'll need to keep your staff accountable, make sure your work is being done, knowing when not to micromanage. They need to keep up the communication in your lab, and that can be really hard for a PI to take on. So make sure you have a good manager to handle that. Also, do you need a digital media person now that you're conducting your research online? Can your data manager extract all this information and merge it? Do they know how to handle online data? And then one very important thing is to include the student population in your work. We have a lot of students. We have graduate students, work study, course credit, internships. It really gives them a great experience in dealing with participants and a very deep understanding of research and like the onboarding consent process. It's extremely valuable. Anytime you can grab students to train them, the better. And then just some added expenses to think about. Things that came up for us were REDCap fees, Fitbit scales, any online recruitment costs, digital imagery like Kaylei was talking about with Pablo or Canva, or costs for data collection tools like Gridix. So these are things you'll want to consider rebudgeting for. So thank you so much for taking the time to listen to our webinar today. That pretty much wraps it up. Did have a lot of questions come in, and I'm not quite sure if we have all of them answered, but I do see a couple that came in um, through email. So just let me see what those are. Oh, and I wanted to point you, if you didn't want to hang on and listen to the questions, is to check out the core platform. I have it posted on this slide. They share a lot of resources and can be a great resource when you're transitioning your project. So check that out. One of the emails that I notice here is, what is your success rate with recruiting online versus locally? Kaylei, do you want to take that one on?
Oh, yes. So can you say the question for me again?
Yeah, what are your success rates when you recruit online versus locally?
Oh, yeah. So, our success rates recruiting online versus locally, is pretty great. Usually online is typically better than locally. There's just our local population isn't very diverse. So what happens is that when we recruit online, we get a lot more added diversity. So that's really good. You have a lot more of a wider range to recruit from people, from technically our studies are nationally, so we can recruit from outside of just our local area in Connecticut. We go from, we've had people as far as like Hawaii and Alaska come. So that really helps.
Yeah, that's great. And it really reduces the time needed for recruitment, like from
Yes.
months to weeks.
Yes.
Let's see, here's another. Did you have to transition any of your projects to remote delivery during the pandemic? And actually, we were already remote, so we did not have to transition any. So it was pretty seamless for us. We just had to move our staffing to out of the office to work remotely, but we were lucky in that all of our projects were already set up. Kaylei, have you noticed if there are any questions we did not answer in the chat?
Yes, someone just asked. We have been told that Yukon Health does not support Dropbox. What do others use that function in the same way? Ooh, good question.
Yeah, we don't use Dropbox. We use OneNote,
OneDrive.
OneDrive. Yeah.
It's like it's just like it's built into like Outlook essentially, and you're like Microsoft 365. So for Yukon, that should work good. Another question I think that we got earlier that I don't believe we addressed that was somebody who wanted to know about payments for Facebook advertisements. And they wanted to know how that works. So for payments on any kind of social media advertisement that you do, they want just a regular credit card. So however that works with your institution, whether it be like maybe a credit card that your lab has, maybe it has to be a departmental credit card, something like that. You just have to put in a credit card. So I just wanted to answer that.
Yeah, and I think with Facebook, you have a set amount that you tell Facebook you want to spend per day, and per how many times it shows to viewers as well.
Yep. Yep.
I see another question here. What is the biggest issue that you encountered going to remote? So I think for us, our biggest issue, I think, would be the delay with IRB reviewing modifications. So you'll want to be, you really want to consider that with your timeline and how that might affect things, or talk directly with them to try to get a quick turnaround on certain important modifications. Um, so yeah, that can be really important because it could throw your project off task. The Also, I think one thing was their lack of knowledge about social media research. So we did try to provide them some education about what we were doing and how it worked, and really providing a lot of background into what we're doing and the protocols behind what we're doing and why we're doing it. Were there any other questions, Kaylei?
Um, I do not see any more.
All right. Well, it's 1 o'clock, so we will sign off. And I just want to thank you all for joining us today.
Awesome. Thank you so much, everyone.